February 26th. Cross-examination of Sherry Culhane was very aggressive, especially as it pertained to contamination of tests related to the bullet found in the garage with the victim's DNA. Sherry held up pretty well on the examination, but it was very long. During the morning, the defense attempted to shift the defense theory from planting evidence of blood, which would be a blood vial in the Manitowoc County Clerk of Court's office, to planting of other DNA on the victim's key and hood latch, as speculated by suggesting that the buccal swabs of the defendant after examination at the crime lab were returned to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department and available to be planted. During the lunch break, we had the evidence brought to the court from the adjoining county. We took the chance of having the witness open the package and hoped that it was all still sealed. From the outside, nobody would realize that I called the shot and had the witness open the exhibit blind. It worked out for us, as the sample was sealed, but the whole prosecution team was holding its collective breath with what almost happened. In fact, Norm Gahn said, "You're the gambler. You make the decision." We ended the day with direct examination of the blood spatter expert, Nick Stalkey, and will conclude tomorrow.
This is John Lee for Post-Crescent.com outside the Calumet County Courthouse. Sherry Culhane of the Wisconsin State Crime Lab spent most of Friday on the stand being questioned by prosecutors and explaining how she found Stephen Avery's blood on 6 spots of Teresa Halbach's vehicle and found Halbach's DNA on a bullet fragment that was removed from Avery's garage 4 months after the initial investigation. She spent most of today on the stand being cross-examined by defense attorney Jerome Buting, who brought out that the sample that showed DNA from Halbach on the bullet fragment was contaminated.
In this case, Mr. Fassbender asked you to try to put Teresa Halbach in the defendant's garage or house, right?
As I said before, any request from the investigator had no bearing whatsoever on my examination or my results.
No bearing whatsoever. And yet, for the first time in your career, you deviate from a protocol to find one piece of evidence, the only piece of evidence in this entire case that links Teresa Halbach to Mr. Avery's garage or house. You deviated from the protocol so that you could call her on that one piece of evidence.
Objection,
right?
Your Honor. Argumentative.
The objection is sustained.
It was the first time in her 23 years in the crime lab that she signed a form deviating from normal protocol. But under questioning again by Special Prosecutor Norm Gahn, Culhane explained that the contamination occurred in the control sample, not the bullet fragment DNA sample, and said that Teresa Halbach's DNA and only Teresa Halbach's DNA were found on that bullet. Nick Stalkey of the State Crime Lab, a blood spatter expert, testified today that blood spots in Teresa Halbach's vehicle and in Stephen Avery's car were placed by somebody who had an actively bleeding wound. That ties in with evidence that police talked about later of seeing a gash on Avery's right hand when he was first interviewed after Teresa Halbach disappeared. Stalkey will be back on the stand tomorrow morning for cross-examination by defense attorneys. But he also testified that blood spots and swabs in the rear cargo area of Teresa Halbach's sport utility vehicle were consistent with a body being put in that vehicle. The night ended on an emotional note after court, with press conferences by attorneys from both sides. Prosecutor Norm Gahn said he was boiling mad at accusations made by the defense about law enforcement officers planting evidence.
No police officer went in and took buccal swabs of Stephen Avery and rubbed it on keys. This is nonsense. We've said it all along. It's nonsense. It's an appalling defense, and we're going to meet it, and we're going to meet it head on.
Defense attorney Jerome Buting said he was boiling mad about the sloppiness of the investigation, the attempt by law enforcement to frame Avery, and the involvement by Manitowoc County Police long after the media and the public were told Manitowoc was no longer involved in the investigation.
Talk about making your blood boil. I mean, what we heard today should be shocking to the citizens of this state, that this is the state of their crime lab. This is Exhibit A for why there ought to be more crime lab analysts in that bill that's pending right now. This crime lab is obviously overworked. Sherry Culhane is either an incompetent leader or she's overworked if she's making that many mistakes trying to train all these people.
The trial continues tomorrow.
Today began the wrap-up and cross-examination of the state's blood spatter expert, who, like most experts in the case, seems compelled to characterize the defense theories as possible rather than the nonsense that they are. We then called 3 citizens on the Avery property the day Teresa was killed. Blaine Dassey, the nephew of the defendant and brother of the co-defendant, Brendan Dassey, to his credit admitted seeing his uncle, Steve, burning bags of material in his burn barrel upon his return from school at about 3:45 p.m. that Halloween afternoon. Bob Fabian, a friend of the Avery brothers, who was rabbit hunting with the defendant's brother Earl, and who at about dusk saw and smelled Stephen Avery burning plastic items in his burn barrel, presumably the victim's cell phone and camera components. And we heard from Scott Taddick, Barb Yanda's then boyfriend and now husband, who saw Stephen tending a very large fire behind his garage early in the evening of October 31st, again presumably at the time when the victim's mutilated body was being incinerated. All held up pretty well on cross-examination, given their intellectual limitations. We then called what should have been a couple of easy witnesses, custodians of cell records from Teresa and Steve. The witness from Cellcom, Bobby Dorwart, was a technical research type and had the ability to not just identify records, but to interpret their meaning. Cell calls are used in this case to establish the timeline of events, especially Teresa's arrival at the Avery property, showing when she was killed and who was on the property at the time with an opportunity to have committed the crimes. The second witness, however, from Singular Wireless, her name was Lori Shadry, was a store manager and, despite being a custodian of records, obviously didn't know what they meant. She turned out to be a substitute for their technical witness, who was away on maternity leave. With what I thought was an agreement from the defense, a stipulation as to the records, I didn't think it was going to be a problem. But one of the defense attorneys, Jerry Buting, who revels in being a jerk, especially in front of the jury, made it look like these records not only were contested, but showed that Teresa may even have been alive 2 days after she was murdered. This blatant attempt to mislead the jury and make the state look foolish in the process caused problems for the rest of the day. My philosophy in trying cases is very simple. I only put on evidence that matters. I don't object to that which isn't a big deal. I never try to make the other attorney look foolish out of professional courtesy. I never show up a judge in court, even if I disagree with a ruling. Judges deserve respect in court, and I just live with their rulings and don't comment on them. Most importantly, my word is gold. I will never renege on a promise or a stipulation that I've made to any attorney in any court. So when any of those things happen to me, I become very, very upset, sometimes to the point of losing my composure. I can't usually afford to do that in front of the jury, but some less ethical practitioners think it's gamesmanship. I think it's just plain unprofessional. We received the report today from the FBI, proving that the vial of blood the defense has theorized within the clerk of court's office and was stolen by sworn law enforcement officers used to plant blood in the victim's SUV has been excluded as the source of blood in the SUV. The scientific evidence should get into the trial. We'll find out after this weekend, which will probably kill the planting defense even before it's raised. Now it's up to the judge to do the right thing and to allow its admissibility.
This is John Lee for Post-Crescent.com with an update on the Stephen Avery homicide trial. 3 people, including 2 of Stephen Avery's relatives, testified today that they saw fires near Avery's house trailer the afternoon of October 31st, 2005, the day that Teresa Halbach disappeared. Avery's nephew Blaine Dacey and friend Robert Fabian, who was rabbit hunting in the salvage yard that day with Avery's brother, both testified they saw fires in burn barrels at Avery's trailer that afternoon. Scott Todick, who is now married to Avery's sister, the former Barb Yonda, testified that he saw a large bonfire the evening of October 31st when he dropped Barb off at the house. Blaine Dacey had also testified about seeing that bonfire, and they both said they saw Stephen Avery standing near it. The next 2 witnesses being called by Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz today are custodians of telephone records for cell telephone companies that Stephen Avery and Teresa Halbach used. That will take us up to 39 witnesses so far in this trial. Remember to click on postcrescent.com for up-to-the-minute updates and analysis.
February 28th. Today we started testimony from Tom Sturdivant, an arson investigator for DCI, who testified about finding bones in the defendant's burn area and processing the scene with the crime lab. Dr. Donald Simley, a forensic odontologist, testified regarding finding one of the victim's teeth, tooth number 31, and matching it to x-rays taken before her death. We took brief testimony from the victim's mother, Karen Halbach, about some receipts and about how close their family was. The rest of today was the witness that I had been waiting for since the case began, Dr. Leslie Eisenberg, our forensic anthropologist, who recounted processing all of the human remains found in the defendant's burn area and finding virtually every bone from the mutilated skeleton of the victim. She's perhaps the smartest woman I've ever met and is equally genuine, having a great manner of testimony before the jury. Her opinion included finding 2 defects in the victim's cranial remains, suggesting that the victim was shot at least twice in the head. Although her cross-examination continues tomorrow, I have no fear regarding her responses. Her professionalism is outstanding.
This is John Lee with a video update for Gannett, Wisconsin newspapers from outside the Calumet County Courthouse. Teresa Halbach's mother, Karen, took the stand briefly this noon, talking about her daughter, Teresa, how she spent time with the family, and how she hasn't heard from her or talked to her since October 31st, 2005, just to bolster the prosecution's assertion that she is dead and to deflate defense allegations to the contrary. Most of the day, however, was taken up by two Wisconsin experts who helped identify victims after the World Trade Center attack on September 11th and after Hurricane Katrina. Dr. Donald Simley, a forensic dentist from Madison, matched one tooth found in Stephen Avery's burn pit to a molar of Teresa Halbach's using dental records and reconstruction. Dr. Leslie Eisenberg, a forensic anthropologist from Madison, matched the bones as those being from an adult female and determined the cause of death to be homicidal violence. The bones that Eisenberg identified were eventually determined to be Teresa Halbach's through FBI testing. We'll continue with more testing and more testimony from the Stephen Avery homicide trial later today and the rest of this week.
March 1st. Cross-examination of Leslie Eisenberg went as expected. She's too smart to allow any of her opinions to be challenged by attorneys, those with no real experience or knowledge in anthropology. She ended her testimony like it began, clear, believable, and very powerful. Our next witness was a very young analyst from the FBI, Curtis Thomas, who positively identified the victim's cell phone, digital camera, and PDA found destroyed in the defendant's burn barrel. Our last witness of the day was Bill Newhouse, a very experienced firearms and ballistics expert who testified that the bullet recovered was fired from the gun in the defendant's possession, that the shell casings recovered were fired from that same gun, and general explanations of how firearms work and how matches are determined. The defense used the same criticism of the science and protocols. I have a hard time reading how much weight is being given to our evidence or the attacks thereon by the jury. Tomorrow we'll hear from a trace evidence expert and a forensic pathologist. That, together with my wife and son being there, will make for a very interesting day.
This is John Lee for Gannett, Wisconsin newspapers with an update on the Stephen Avery homicide trial and with the Wisconsin weather. I'm standing outside the courthouse in Chilton. Dr. Leslie Eisenberg, a forensic anthropologist from Madison, is back on the witness stand today under cross-examination by lead defense attorney Dean Strang. We expect that she will wrap up her cross-examination soon. Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz said last night after court that he expects to wrap up his case possibly in less than a week. He said he has a variety of law enforcement, expert, and citizen witnesses to call yet. We had testimony today from prosecution witness Bill Newhouse, a firearms expert with the State Crime Lab, tying a bullet fragment found in Stephen Avery's garage March 1st, about 4 months after he was arrested, to a gun that Stephen Avery had in his home the day he was arrested. That is the same bullet fragment that defense attorneys refer to as the magic bullet, and the same fragment that DNA analyst Sherry Culhane testified earlier this week had Teresa Halbach's DNA on it. That testimony brought cross-examination from defense attorneys, and defense attorney Jerome Buting said that it is based on inexact and junk science, much like hair analysis was 22 years ago when Stephen Avery was convicted of a rape charge. We also had testimony from Kurt Thomas, an electronics expert with the FBI, who tied in burnt evidence from burn barrels and the burn pit in Stephen Avery's yard to Teresa Halbach's cell phone, camera card, and PDA.
Just give us an overview. Tell the jury what it is that these components are and what it is that we're looking at.
There are components from approximately 3 devices in here. You can see here, this is the front cover for a Motorola Razr cellular telephone. This is the back cover for the same phone. This here is some of the front internal pieces. This is the front lens cover for a PowerShot camera from Canon. This right here is the circuit board that's inside a Palm Zyre PDA.
This is John Lee for Gannett, Wisconsin Newspapers in Chilton. Click on www.post-crescent.com for up-to-the-minute updates. March 2nd. Only 2 witnesses on this half day of court, but both were very important. Again, my wife and son showed up, talked to everyone in the office, and got seats in the courtroom. This would represent the first and only time my son Andy would ever see me in a courtroom. Ken Olson, a forensic scientist specializing in examination of trace elements, testified that he looked at cranial fragments of the victim found behind the defendant's garage and observed particles of lead on them. This demonstrates that lead spray was left from bullets passing through the victim's skull. The last witness was Dr. Jeffrey Jensen, forensic pathologist who's the medical examiner for Milwaukee. Dr. Jensen does over 300 autopsies per year, oversees about 100 of them himself, and probably sees over 100 cases each year of gunshots to the head. Upon examination of the bone fragments, the photos, the x-rays, and other materials, Dr. Jensen determined that the manner of death in this case was homicide, and the cause of death was gunshot to the head. He was unshakable on cross-examination, and his testifying about once a week for the past 20 years has really showed up. Monday brings a huge admissibility hearing deciding if the defense of planted evidence can be scientifically obliterated. This is John Lee for Gannett, Wisconsin Newspapers with an update on the Stephen Avery homicide trial in Chilton. Ken Olson, a forensic scientist with 27 years' experience at the Wisconsin Crime Lab, testified this morning that he examined several pieces of skull that were charred and removed from burn barrel on Stephen Avery's property in November 2005. He testified that pieces of the skull had been damaged by a high-energy projectile consistent with a bullet, and testified later that he found trace elements of lead in several pieces of the skull. He said bullets for my .22 caliber rifle, such as was seized from Avery's home, are made of 99% lead. Week 3 of Stephen Avery's homicide trial ended on a high note for the prosecution, with Dr. Jeffrey Jensen, the Milwaukee County medical examiner, saying bone fragments and other information he reviewed showed that Teresa Halbach died of a gunshot wound to the head, and the manner of death was homicide.
Based upon your examination of the skull fragments and the x-rays and all the associated records and reports that you reviewed in this case, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the manner of Teresa Halbach's death?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
It would be my opinion that she died as a result of gunshot wounds to the head, and that the manner of her death would be homicide.
Judge Willis sent the jury home before noon to wrap up week 3 and told jurors they would not be brought back Monday. Monday is scheduled for a day-long evidentiary hearing. Attorneys in the case will only say that it's a major piece of evidence and that there will be one or more expert witnesses. Special Prosecutor Ken Kratz said after the rulings expected from Judge Willis Monday will help him determine the shape of the rest of his prosecution's case. He said he is on track to wrap that case sometime next week. This is John Lee at Chilton. Remember to check with Gannett, Wisconsin newspapers for updates next week from Chilton.